There's a particular facet around the homeless phenomena that I want to draw attention to because it takes some digging to notice it as a pattern. Now, I first noticed this pattern as a teenage boy babysitting my 4 younger siblings. So there was a lot of abuse in my family, and as part of a divorce phenomena, the parents of my mother and father basically armed the kids, which is a very painful phenomena. But they used the kids to hurt each other. And so, in this dynamic, rather than being supported by the parents, the children are being damaged to protect and to protect one parent's position to hurt the other parent. Now, anyone that knows anything about psychology will tell you this will bring out the worst in the children. So this was one dynamic. Now, the other dynamic was my parents had abuse histories of their own, and as a result, were very uncomfortable facing many of their own feelings. Now, this happens in abusive households because when a child is traumatized at an early age, trauma is one of those feelings and one of those phenomena where it's very difficult to deal with the emotion or the situation alone. So what a child does is they dissociate. They flip a breaker, that bit goes numb, so that they can cope. Now, the problem is that when this goes on a lot and doesn't get sorted out as an adult, there are these terrains in a relationship, in any intimate relationship, that draw those feelings, those repressed childhood feelings, back into view. Now, in a healthy adult relationship and family, these things get discussed openly. The parents get help with a therapist, and the burden gets lifted from the child. But in a repressive culture where, it's viewed as weak to receive therapy or anything like that, the parents are determined to block their own repressed feelings because they're ashamed of them, because they don't know what to do with them, because they don't understand them. And it's no reason, there's every reason to understand why this is happening because, like most Americans, they didn't receive trauma training in school. They didn't receive, there was no classroom at school and high school that says, here's how you know if your parents are abusing you. Here's why they may be abusing you. Here's how intergenerational patterns of narcissism and sexual abuse pass from this generation to the next. So when you keep a whole generation of children blind. In fact, if you keep multiple generations of children blind, it's perfectly obvious why a parent wouldn't know how to deal with these feelings. But here's the thing. When a parent doesn't know how to deal with their own suppressed feelings, they suppress them. And one of the biggest things that I started noticing as I would babysit my I was 14, 15, 16 years old babysitting my 4 younger siblings, is that when I babysat those siblings, and this is coming round to this pattern, it's hard to explain, so bear with me. I would babysit my siblings, and they were great kids. They didn't act out, there wasn't tantruming, there wasn't, shouting and insults. And then I'd noticed that within 5 minutes of my parents coming home, they would be back behaving like complete delinquents. My younger brother would steal cars, my sister would begin pontificating, the younger brother would start throwing things, the other brother would have a tantrum. And what I found even more interesting was that my parents would cue this to happen. So, walk in the door, of course, there's silent, happy kids, drawing, doing things, talking, cooking their food, etc., because, they were very capable. I would have my younger siblings, cook their own food and clean up their own messes and do basic responsible things. And kids love this. Kids love to feel competent and in a safe, secure environment. So normally delinquent kids would behave very well in this paradigm. Parents come home, what's going on? Why is it so quiet here? And the kids would get the cue and they'd start acting up. And I realized that my parents needed the kids to act out. And the question was why? Why would, because on the surface, my parents were, sending us to Waldorf school, reading interesting psychological books, talking about how much they loved us. And yet this pattern was one of sustained escalation, neglect, violation, abuse. It brought out the worst in the kids. So I sat my father down at age 14, 15. I said, look, Dad, these kids are not problem kids. You are problem parents. They don't give me any problem. It's unusual for siblings to show respect for someone, just 2-3 years older. So I've got a harder time being a babysitter than you have being a parent. But they're good kids with me. Do you want to know why and what you do to elicit the worst in your children? And what I do to make things better. Now, with a truly abusive, set of parents, that really, overtly hate the children and want to hurt them in every way, this wouldn't be, of course they're not going to have any interest. But what was interesting was my parents were operating under a posture that they were progressive, intelligent, great parents, and that we were the problem. What could they possibly do? They'd, had a nice house. They sent us to private school. We had organic food. We were lucky kids. And so, what was interesting was this juxtaposition of a certain amount of superiority, kind of, we're progressive parents, and you're lucky. And this, subtext, this underlying pattern of abuse and bringing out the worst. So a truly, interested parent in the best interest of their child is, of course, going to be delighted to hear about this. But my father went pale. And that's when I began seeing this split between the authority that wants to look good and the authority that has addictive abuse patterns that their priority is that they don't come to light. That's really what, if I was to sum it up, I would say that my parents needed dysfunctional kids to distract them from their own feelings and to hurt each other because they felt helpless and, there was a lot going on emotionally for them around the marriage. So they couldn't deal with being someone who would, criminalize their children and abuse them. So they had to do it in this roundabout way. So they, spent all this money on private school and stuff like that. But then their behavior, their covert messages were constantly bringing out the worst. And then blaming that on the child. And the reason I'm dwelling on this is it's a tough thing to pick up. I feel pretty lucky that I spotted it at 14 and I withdrew from the family system. But the kids, for the most part, didn't realize what's going on. They were a little younger. And, I think it's a pattern analyzing talent that notices these subtext patterns. But I see a certain thing, so my parents didn't change was the interesting thing. There wasn't a, oh, tell me more, we'd love to solve this problem, which was easily solvable. In other words, my kids weren't the problem, my parents were. They could spend less energy. They actually had to work pretty hard to draw out the worst in my siblings because they were good kids. But if two parents are hammering away at the positive nature of a child, they can bring out the worst. They can traumatize them. They can manipulate them. They can escalate the child's pain. They can addict them in sugar. They can bribe them in unhealthy ways. You know, go tell your mom this and I'll give you a candy bar. Don't tell anyone that I'm, lying here and I'll give you a treat. You know, you can bribe a child in an unhealthy way, meaning the sugar is bad for their health. The bribery is a poor ethic to teach a child. The power dynamic of elevating a child above the other parent and making them complicit. This is incredibly destructive behavior for a healthy, integrated family. I mean, it's rampant in America. But that's, I think, one of the reasons we deal with this same dynamic at a governmental level. Because we have a similar, I would summarize the parental pattern is that we're going to work hard to draw out the worst in you. We're not going to support and validate, the basic goodness that you are. Then we're going to put on a show about what great parents we are. We're going to deny all of that kind of underhanded game playing. And then when you become dysfunctional in that mixed message, we're going to blame it on you. We're not going to take any responsibility. So, fast forward to the homeless dynamic in Marin County. Well, I've been a contractor for 25 years. And every time I interact with a permitting agency, the interaction is, let's say, suboptimal. They could come out to the site, meet the neighbors who I'd consulted with, and everyone's on board. This is an intelligent use of money to improve a neighborhood. But they have no interest in coming out and seeing the reality. No. They want you to draw the reality, draw it all out in this. And then they don't say, well, gee, we didn't come out, and so we don't know what's going on. They say, well, where's this here? And you go back and draw that for them. And then they say, well, that's not in our proper size. And, they just make everything as difficult as possible as a contractor. It's irritating. Now, of course, I pass these costs on to my client, but they are substantial costs that waste time and money for all concerned, because any intelligent person could come out in a lot of these situations and say, sure, no one's going to be harmed. You're all good with the neighbors. Great, just do it. We don't need to be involved. But they want to be involved. They want to micromanage stuff. Now, having secured their right to micromanage stuff, then they say, oh, we don't have time to do it. So, the most simple thing, like we want to stick up a wire fence. Oh, well, that's going to take us 2 months. We're backed up. So just rearrange your schedules to do a one-day job 2 months from now as opposed to, right now, because we now that we've inserted ourselves, we've got to slow everything down. And then since, we're overworked here, you got to pay us lots of money. It's like, how long does it take you to look at a little drawing and say, done? 5 minutes? So what's this $1,000 fee? What's this? This is absurd. Well, of course, the client's irritated by this, so it increases the tension in the client-contractor thing, but it makes everyone in the permit department feel fine. And then you have to explain to the client that even though what you're doing is perfectly fine from their perspective, from your perspective, and the neighbor's perspective, it doesn't meet some arcane code. And yet they say, well, why? And then you say, it doesn't actually make any sense. They said this is for fire, but if we do it this way on your job, the firefighter will have a harder job. But if we do it this way, it'd actually be good for a firefighter. If I was a firefighter, I'd want to come at it like this. Well, so why do we have to do this? Who knows? They won't even come out to the site and look at these in a common sense way. And so You increase the time, you increase the irritation, you increase the insanity, you increase the budget. And then you mandate things that have to be done, like, you don't have an outlet every 6 feet. The client doesn't want an outlet every 6 feet. Well, you have to. That's the code. Well, who made the code? Well, we did. Well, who did you make it for? Yourselves? Are you living in this house? No. That's just the code. And we've actually made it illegal for people to build things that they are perfectly capable of building. It's illegal for a client to move into their house half finished, which drives up the cost of housing because they've got to stay in a hotel. In fact, I had a client that called me frantically, and he said they won't let me move into my house because the drip irrigation system, which has not been installed, hasn't been designed. And I said, well, just tell them you're going to add a 1 gallon per hour dripper to every plant, when you get around to it. No. They have to have it drawn out. Well, can I just draw a sketch? Can I write that? No, that's not good enough. We want a scaled drawing of the plant. Well, it's this endless absurdity. Well, that cost that client $1,000. The trouble is there are hundreds of these absurdities. And hundreds of absurdities add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what it means is that in the land of the free and in the land of the brave, we don't have the freedom to even live in our own houses, to even construct our own houses. And rather than the authorities being challenged for ignorance, incompetence, and, if at the core Constitution, the right to pursue happiness, I have never met a client happy with their building department by the time their house is done. Well, if you make it illegal not to engage with an agency that makes you unhappy, how is that the right to pursue happiness? If you not only make it illegal to be happy, i.e. just get these idiots out of the space so that you have the freedom to make an informed decision. You see, because it's very different whether you have a set of codes that would be called best practices. I'm all for this. I'm all for a set of codes on an app that would have best practices. That the optimal outlet range in a kitchen is every 6 feet. That it's ideal if every bathroom has a fan. That it's ideal if the bathroom floor is this. And the reason for it. So optimal best practice, this, and this. And for the client to go through and check which things are important to them after reading the reason. We have things like double check valves in, Marin County, which are for a very, very, very arcane situation where a house is higher than the main, where there's irrigation that's higher than the house, and where certain toxic chemicals in an irrigation system with a leak or with chemicals in the irrigation system could, in a very rare situation, This is basically about 10 different things all have to happen at once, and then it is just possible, if all those 10 things happened, that, X units of contaminated water would be into the main. So we're going to require a $500 investment for every single house in the state to make sure that that doesn't happen, even if the house is below the water main, even if the garden irrigation is below the house, even if there's anti-siphon valve, even if, you've got to do this. It doesn't make any sense. But you take $500 times millions of homes, and you're dealing with $1 billion error. And you don't make it a choice. You see, that's the thing. It doesn't harm any neighbor if a client says, skip the outlets around the top of the kitchen, area. I don't need them. It doesn't hurt the client. It doesn't hurt any neighbors. It saves money. It reduces housing costs. I mean, imagine if the Indians 500 years ago in teepees had, set up their ring of wood and lit their little fire and, living very sustainably, no big carbon footprint here. And you can't go in your teepee. Why? You don't have electricity. Well, we don't want it. Well, you can't go in your teepee then. I mean, we're really that backwards where we have less freedom today than our Native American ancestors 5 years ago. And taxpayer money has been spent to curtail and bottleneck every little thing into this huge ordeal. So we have this dynamic where the authority, the good parent, for our own good, has mandated this and mandated this and mandated that and mandated this, and creates stress because, you see, the building department doesn't deal with the spousal argument that happens when, we can't go to Hawaii this week. Why? Because your friendly building official said that more efficient approach that we wanted to do, that we would have been happy with, it can't be done. Why? Well, it doesn't meet code. Well, what are they doing in our house? Who are these people that say how I have to live in my own house? Well, they're your friendly government. You see, it's the spouses that fight. It's the spouses that have divorces. It's the kids' education that gets cut, so that our local housing authorities can feel proud of themselves for creating yet more expensive legislation every single year, but then to ram it down people's throats. These are not recommendations. I think every homeowner should be required to review the recommendations, the reasons, and the statistical data behind them. i.e., we recommend you put in a double check valve. How many deaths have ever occurred in history as a result of there not being a double check valve? How many cancer cases? Anything? No, we just recommend it anyway for no particular reason. Or it's 1 in 2 million. Okay, so is it worth spending $2 billion for the 1 in 2 million because all 2 million are going to have to spend $500? That's $2 billion for an off chance. And should it be required by code or only if it makes sense and the homeowner can comfortably afford it? You see, recommendations and legalization are completely different. We've actually made it criminal for people to move into their own houses as they would design them, in making educated risks. So what's absurd about this is this has driven up the cost of housing in Marin to where you can't build anything less than $650,000 even if you want to. Okay, so we haven't simultaneously created an economy or a financial framework in which every single Marin resident can afford $650,000, thus creating homelessness. We create homelessness, but then rather than having the decency to say we're sorry for overlooking, this reality, we've been so focused on the perfect house that we weren't paying any attention to the fact that you can't afford it. And now we've made it illegal to move into a less than perfect house. Rather than apologize for that, we're going to criminalize you and shame you for being homeless. We're going to make it harder for you to get a job because you go to a job application, etc., and you fill it out, and you can't get a job if you say, I'm homeless. So now you can't afford even your hovel. Before you had a job, etc., and you could have afforded a teepee. You could have afforded a tent. You could have afforded a tiny house on wheels. You could have afforded whatever it was that you could afford. And you could work up from there. You see, I'm not sure we realize just how insulting this is to the American intelligence. Because when I go to Thailand, people with no college education, obviously they don't speak English, people with no training in architecture are legally allowed to build a single-story structure on their land as they see fit. And strangely enough, the Thais don't design houses with the intention that they fall over. And because they watched their father and their sisters and their brothers build houses before, it's not rocket science. Nor do you need massive engineering to build a simple single-story structure. And so they have lives, and they have houses, earning $300 a month, that American citizens are prohibited by law from doing. And the message is, oh sure, the Thais, they're competent to build their own house. But an American, those fools, no question about it, if you let them build a single-story house, they'd be building houses that fell over on them. They'd be building houses that leaked. If they leaked, they would die. They wouldn't be able to fix the leak. If there was a crack in the concrete, they would be completely rendered helpless. They couldn't possibly, get it repaired. No. Americans are idiots. We have got to babysit them and make sure they don't make any mistakes. It's insulting. It's profoundly insulting. And so our parental structures create a problem and then dump their problem onto the most vulnerable people, the people with the least money in a capitalist framework, and then don't have the decency to help them out of the hole that we as a culture created for them and imposed on them and did not consult them about. We've taken away their freedom to say, you know what? I've made an educated decision. I've decided that living under a bridge is more dangerous than moving onto my own land with a yurt or a teepee. I've talked with my neighbor. Frankly, they prefer the teepee to my 4,000 square foot mansion. Now, I may get around to building the 4,000 square foot mansion later, but they prefer the teepee. And you know what? So does the environment. 4,000 square foot mansion, heating, electrical, lighting, contractors driving back and forth for 1 to 2 years to finish the project, or some poles and a mortgage-free legal space to live. They prefer the teepee. Well, it doesn't matter what your neighbors think. It doesn't matter what you want. It doesn't matter what's good for you. It doesn't matter what's good for the environment. The only thing that matters is we at the building department who know the way you should build, and we know what you should pay for that, and we know you should wait 3 years, just stay under the bridge, until we approve your permit. Do we want a country where our government creates problems for its people and then burdens those people with the problems they created and gets to look like great local government? Aren't you lucky we came around and wrote all these codes? Because no doubt you couldn't possibly do it on your own. So there's this pattern. And I think it's a very important one to look out for, because there wouldn't be a housing crisis without the zoning and building codes that created the housing crisis any more than and you just have to step back a little bit and say that if you went around offering deeds for houses for $100 a pop, is there anyone who'd still be homeless? No. You go to the other side and you say, well, if we go around offering $1 billion deeds, would any of us have a home? Less than 1% of us can afford a $1 billion house. So the laws that determine the cost of the house determine how many people will be housed. And I think it's criminal and murderous to create laws that dramatically escalate the cost of housing above what a segment of the population can afford without simultaneously coming up with the funding to see that every single person has a legal, free place to sleep. And I'm not talking about, a curfew concentration camp where, tell me what you're smoking, tell me what you're doing this, be home by 6 p.m. or it's done. The home of the free and the home of the brave doesn't need concentration camps. It needs the freedom to be entrusted to get on with their own lives as they see fit in the trust that is the basis of a free market system. You see, the whole basis of capitalism is based on enlightened self-interest. Do you realize that if you don't believe that people act in their own interest, the capitalist framework makes no sense? The free market is always right because people will always do what's best for them. They will always take the path of least resistance to get to their goal. And we've built a great economy on the belief in human beings. So how is it that building officials are able to do the exact opposite on the assumption that if people are free to buy the homes they want to buy, to build the homes they want to build, even within basic respectful criteria, like you do anything you want on your land as long as it doesn't generate X decibels of noise, as long as it doesn't generate X amount of pollution for the neighbors, we're not starting a chemical factory, and as long as it's lower than 15 feet off the ground. Anything you want, just do it. The only thing you have to do for the next buyer is spell out in detail how your house complies and doesn't comply with best practices so that they know what they're buying. Now, I think it's reasonable in an earthquake-prone country to say it should also be earthquake stable. But a shipping container sitting on the ground is earthquake stable. Nobody dies if it rattles back and forth a few inches in an earthquake. It's probably stronger built than many of our $1 million homes. People should have the right to live in the space they choose for a budget they can afford, or have an alternative provided.